Gonna start recording. All right. I'm Renee Moorefield, and I'm co-chair for the Wellness and Government Initiative for the Global Wellness Institute. And we are doing different interviews about well-being leadership happening in countries around the world. Today, I am interviewing Emmanuel De Neve, who is Associate Professor of Economics and Strategy at the University of Oxford. And I am really tickled. We've had a chance to talk a couple of times. I am really delighted that you agreed to do this interview. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Renee. My pleasure.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. The first is about the vision that you see for the future of wellness and happiness. What role do you see wellness and happiness play in your country or in the world? I know you've got a unique perspective, so you're not just looking at your particular country, the United Kingdom. You really are looking on a global basis, which is why I was so excited to be talking to you. What role do you see wellness and happiness playing in your country or the world in the next 10 years? So a vision of the future.
Wow, that's a very broad question, but you're right. I do get to see and work a lot with the global data. So in my role at the World Happiness Report, where we obviously do an annual ranking of the happiest places on the planet, working with the Gallup World Poll data, obviously get a good sense for what the happiest places are, what's being done in terms of research, but in terms of practical kind of also advice. I do work with a lot of governments, including in the Emirates and here in the UK, working on and advising on how to bring well-being into policy. And so I think to be honest, the mere fact that, for example, the UN World Happiness Report has actually been set up in 2012, the fact that we have the UN General Assembly resolution unanimously voted in 2012 to start measuring well-being in addition to other metrics, the mere fact that many of these governments are actually starting to think seriously and robustly around measuring well-being and implementing in policy, whether it's the Office for National Statistics in the UK or the new Ministry for Happiness based out of Dubai for the UAE, all of that is absolutely amazing. And then I haven't even mentioned the OECD starting to push measures of well-being and tracking it in an annual report called How's Life. So I am super excited, not because I'm in this field, but because I see this moving very strongly over the past few years, and I see it increasingly becoming more important. A small example, we're leaving next week with a whole delegation to Dubai for a summit day solely focused on the science and happiness and government as part of the World Government Summit. Obviously, it's something that will attract even more attention from many senior policymakers. So all this to say, a whole bunch of little indications that it is becoming and has reached kind of at the top of the agenda of a number of policymakers where it ought to be. And so that's kind of, so in the future, I think is bright for putting well-being and wellness and happiness center stage in policymaking. But I do think it comes out of a place that is perhaps less bright. And that is, for one, that in a lot of advanced societies that are well-to-do, policymakers have realized that further growth isn't necessarily a solution or a way of moving forward that will necessarily translate into general well-being for their societies. So I do think the realization of we have to put well-being center stage comes out of a darker place, which is that, hey, the growth pattern that we've been following is not necessarily translating in general well-being. So we need to be thinking differently and putting general well-being literally center stage rather than sort of looking at GDP as supposedly it means to the end of well-being, which isn't necessarily being very fulfilling. Because if we look at how GDP per capita has grown in many, many states, oftentimes even doubled or tripled in the space of a few decades, even adjusting for inflation, you won't find necessarily that has translated in much gains, if any, in terms of well-being for these developed nations, a la Japan, the United Kingdom, the US, and China, for example. And so, yeah, so that I think is also that. So it's that part of the motivation that is also it comes out of a place of realization that growth isn't necessarily the answer to everything, and a sure means to a happier society. So that realization, it's also, I think, a realization stemming from an even darker place in recent times, and this is the growing inequality.
Mm.
And the economic inequality makes it there's huge, larger differentials in well-being within a society, above and beyond the economic differentials of the economic inequality. And so that too, I think, is having policymakers, very senior policymakers, ask the question, how come we are, say in the United States, they're close to full employment, yet people are very frustrated and anxious and worried, and there's a lot of unhappiness resulting in people voting one way or another, and there being such differentials within society also on that front. And so people are looking beyond items of what is it that makes people so frustrated, and can we measure this frustration? Can we do something about it? What is it driving? And can we do something about it in terms of focusing straight on people's how they feel? And people that are unhappy need to be helped in ways that the classic recipes around economic growth may not necessarily be helping. So for example, globalization, which has been the classic answer to a lot of the growth questions, is not necessarily questioned, but is questioned from a sense of like, okay, who are the winners and who are the losers of globalization? Mm-hmm. Surely there's more winners than losers, which we know as economists, but there's also a number of people who lose out. In specific parts of society lose out because of globalization. Their well-being is down, and so we need to take more care of that. And so all this to say that the future is bright for well-being and wellness and happiness. But the reason why the future is bright is in part because it's a realization that it needs to be confronted, because the economic answers that we've been giving to questions aren't necessarily providing us the right answers.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you feel the future is bright in regards to truly making well-being and happiness a priority at the country level, around the world. However, it comes from a place of gap, like a place we have seen now based on the strategies we've been using. I'm saying this very simplistically, but based on the strategy we've been using, it has created a gap of not only happiness and well-being, but I would also add health, if you look at even some of the traditional health metrics. So what would you see if you and I were having this conversation in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and I said to you, what are markers of progress? Like, how would you know that a shift is actually occurring? So you've already mentioned, number one, countries are starting to make it a priority, even that some countries are starting to include different indices, like the OECD How's Life Index, the World Happiness Report, even that's become now a repeated, something that countries want, and there's a repeatable process for that to occur. So good indications now. What would be indications then that you would say, okay, I look back and we are making a shift to making wellness, well-being, happiness, and I'm using these words all interchangeably because they're all facets kind of the same concept and experience, human existence. What would make you proud? What would actually make you proud?
It's a very good question, and I can give a very short answer to this. It's because we're measuring people's well-being now over time, for in some instances for over the past 20 or 30 years, but at the very least since about 2006 for 157 countries. So the KPI, the key performance indicator to see whether or not we've done a good job at putting well-being center stage and whether we've been successful at it is very simple. It's to see whether the average happiness around the globe, as a compilation of all the mean and the average well-being across the different nations, weighted for population differences, whether that has gone up. And so we will be able to know if in the UN World Happiness Report, again, let me just make sure, it's the World Happiness Report. It's run by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, not necessarily endorsed by the UN, because some people appreciate the fact they're at the bottom or not so much, ironically speaking. Anyway, long story short, we will know if in the World Happiness Report in 2020, for example, the average happiness is a significant step forward from what it is today. That will mean that we will have been successful. Now, how do we get there? And this is, I think, an important point. And it just gets to the mechanics and the mathematics of just averaging out numbers, which is, if you look at the current distribution of happiness, most societies, I think the average is about 5.5 or 6 or so. And in most developed societies, it's around 6, 7. Now, what you find is most people do report being relatively happy. And in developed nations, actually, the majority of people report around 7 or 8 or 9 or even 10 out of 10. But you always find this tail in the distribution of a minority of people, say 20%, of society who report being very unhappy. People actually score and report being 0 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10.
Wow.
These are people that we've identified as either living in abject poverty, even in developed nations, or having real mental health concerns and issues. Mm-hmm. So a very basic way to try and reach our KPI of having a higher average well-being across the globe, I would argue to really focus on the people at the very bottom of the distribution. Because if we can raise 15% of the population from an average of 2 out of 10 to say 5 out of 10, which is doable if we deal with these basic mental and physical concerns, we will have a dramatically powerful impact on the average well-being in society. Much more than if we were to say raise 15% of people that are currently at 8 and move them to 9, which is great, but it will have less impact on the overall well-being of society. So to answer your question in a nutshell, we need to simply look at the global well-being data and see whether or not we're making progress on that. And I think the best way to do so is to focus on the bottom end. And this is important because we tend to, as scholars of happiness and policymaking, and we always think then obviously of the positive, but it's at the bottom end of the happiness scale where there's essentially most happiness bang for our policy buck that can be scored, to put it bluntly.
So I'm just curious, based on the conversation that we got to have before we were doing this interview, what effect do you feel that technology, social media, Twitter, Facebook, all these different tools that we have now that we didn't have even when you started recording this and really looking at well-being and happiness on such a massive scale, how is that influencing, number one, your ability to measure and track and get the information you need? And number two, happiness and well-being itself. Do you have any information or data on those two things?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And in fact, on the first part of your question, like what can we do with these data? I've actually been having discussions about this just today where we're thinking about writing up something. So yes, it's very exciting because right now, all the well-being data is essentially building on relatively small scale, but representative samples of populations, and they being sampled on surveys about happiness. Now, the beauty, so these are what we call stated preferences by people, reports. The beauty of these social media is that one, it's big data, it's huge, it's millions. I mean, there's 500 million tweets a day. And a lot of those can be analyzed in an automated fashion through sentiment analysis, so we can get an almost real-time big data sense for well-being. The big downside or drawback of these big data is that they're not necessarily representative. So it's the people who are on Twitter that we can say something about. It won't allow us to be able to say something about all of the people in China, because perhaps only 5% of people in China are actually on Twitter, if that many. And so that will be, so there's so much promise in big data coming out of social media and the possibility for sentiment analysis from that. And I think it'll be mined in very rich ways and it'll be extremely helpful. But we need to think about the challenge of how can we then make inferences from these data that are representative of what is actually going on in our world society or societies as such. Now, there's one, so what we've been thinking of with our research team is the following. What we could do is combine the two, is look at, say, the Gallup World Poll and see what the average well-being is for, in, say, China or elsewhere, and then see what kind of, how that scores in terms of the sentiment analysis coming out of the big social media data. And then do that for all countries and do this over time. And then eventually it will allow us to put in what we call statistical weights. So we can then actually move forward with just the big data from social media, but apply specific weights that we've calculated in recent past to say, okay, so China has become much happier in 2025 as compared to 2024, but we need to adjust this because the population on Twitter or on social media is not the same as the actual population, so we need to put in the following population weights specifically for China. So I think there's statistical tools to get around the representation issue, representativeness issue of Twitter and social media data, but it's not insolvable. Yeah, so it's not insolvable. So I think moving forward, it'll be super important. So I think that was kind of around question one, the importance of these data. But around question two, how does social media play a role in well-being? I'm aware of a paper on the impact of television on people's well-being, and it's not good. And I'm aware of like there's a number of scholars working on this right now to see how much time you spend on social media and how that influences people's well-being. I haven't seen very conclusive results, but it seems to be indicating that because well-being and happiness is such a relative phenomenon, we do compare and contrast ourselves to the reference points around us, such as our brothers or sisters or our peer group at work or at school. And the mere fact, as we all know, that what gets posted on Facebook, for example, tends to be the best of ourselves and not necessarily the worst of ourselves. So it gives a sense, it represents people in ways, or it in an artificial way drives up the reference points to which we match ourselves.
Right.
And so, such and such are off on an amazing trip to the Bahamas, and I'm just stuck at home. But the fact of the matter is that 99% of people are stuck at home, but you're only seeing the 1% who's having a fun time in the Bahamas. And so that is an issue. So I would expect that when these analyses are properly run, it's likely going to come out the relative aspect of people's happiness and well-being comes in, which we know is important. That dynamic will not play out well. So it's very likely that social media over the whole will actually negatively impact people's well-being. But that needs to be then put against the fact that social media may also connect people to some extent. As we were saying, Renee, just before, thanks to Twitter and Facebook, it also allows people to connect and organize themselves. And so that the March for Women's Rights and Respect that took place just, a week or two ago, would not have been able to have been carried out so effectively if it wasn't for social media. So there's positives. So there's positives and negatives. It's a bit of a balanced story, as progress tends to be, I suppose.
It's interesting thinking about social media. So I did read a study, and it was probably a couple months ago, and it was about the negative, that more people were depressed the more time they were spending on social media, the more they were reporting some depression. Yeah. So you've got that side based on what you were describing, that you're comparing yourself against all these people that are having these wonderful lives, and now you assess that you're not, when really you're having a similar life to most people around you, but you're only seeing the one that has this beautiful life. And then I've got a personal story of, and it's an aspect I've always wanted to actually write Facebook and tell them, have you thought about this when you look at happiness and well-being across the life cycle? So my sister passed about 6 or 7 years ago now, and she had a disease for 12 years, just really an awful disease in the last part of her life. She really was not conscious and aware for much of her day. But when she was on Facebook. She couldn't get out and she wasn't mobile, but she was on Facebook. And you could read her post where she was literally ministering to people, saying, I can tell you that it's all good, it's all fine. Just keep this all in perspective so she was staying connected in a way with people
that she would otherwise not have been able to do.
And I think that there is a well-being and happiness factor right at the end of life that social media and other things too, social media facilitate in a way that we never had before. So that's a whole nother, I don't know, are you guys looking at all at phase of life where people are as you look at the data?
It's a very good question. No, not that I'm aware of. And I'm sure at the same time, social media is obviously mostly practiced by sort of the millennials, right? So the people that were 18 or 20 something when they started with Facebook, they're now about 30. And then maybe it's no longer Facebook. The current teenagers are on, Snapchat or Twitter or Instagram. And so maybe it'll be something else. So I think the population of older people around sort of the ages that you're describing, end of life stages, are perhaps less on Facebook, but it can be a bit of a savior to them and allow them to connect to friends without necessarily having to connect physically, which wouldn't have been possible. Right. So so as we were saying, so there's negative aspects that have been studied on reference points that are artificially raised and thus negatively impact people's well-being. But there are aspects of social media that are very powerful in connecting people that would otherwise not be connected. And so it's a mixed bag. And it'll be interesting to see in the long run how this plays out.
So let me ask you one last question, because I know I'm just very aware of our time. What are you most hopeful about when it comes to the movement of happiness, well-being, and it becoming more of a priority in our world in a way that is very meaningful? My vision is a world that works for all, and I know that's idealistic, but that's what wakes me up in the morning. Yeah. So I get that you have a similar, maybe
Yeah.
words, but a very similar vision. What makes you most hopeful?
Yeah, this is going to be a very nerdy economist response, but there's a famous saying which says, "What gets measured gets done."
Mhm.
And so the mere fact that happiness is now being measured appropriately across the world and in communities, and most national statistics offices are actually starting to measure it. The OECD is pushing it. So the mere fact that we're now able to show people whether well-being is increasing or decreasing and say the World Happiness Report ranking, which started in 2012, has had such an impact. You know, over 1 million people are actually downloading the report each year. So it is starting to have impact. I think it's also what's driving the fact that now these policymakers who are all running around on evidence-based policy want to be able to show the impact on well-being. So what stems me hopeful is that we now have good measurements, and that is something that policymakers are able to track and push for as key performance indicators moving forward. And this is actually important because when this dates back to GDP, I think in 1934, when Simon Kuznets, a Nobel laureate who invented national income accounts, the person who invented GDP essentially, when he spoke to the US Congress introducing his measures, he says, please don't take my measure of national income accounting, GDP, as the measure of social progress. Mm-hmm. But because it became a measure, and because what gets measured gets done, for the next sort of, 70, 80 years, it has become the main measure of our success as societies. Mm-hmm. And so I think and really lots of appreciation, kudos to the people who've made it possible across the world now to really start measuring this. So the Gallup organization since 2006, measuring well-being globally. The Eurobarometer, the Latino Barometer, doing it in smaller samples since the 70s and the 80s. The Office for National Statistics since 2012 doing it. So I think that revolution in actually measuring well-being will make that people will start paying more notice and will be able to track success and performance over time. So that actually does stem me hopeful. And I know it's very nerdy economics, sort of policy wonky type response, but that is good. And you know why it's so good is because then it helps people focus on the things that matter. Mm-hmm. Because I know it sounds so silly and sort of instrumentalizing or making it seem so lowly, but because the key performance indicator this becomes how happy you are on average as a society, and if a society has a 6.8 out of 10, but has a small tail of people at the bottom, then it's just the mathematics of averaging things out that you ought to be focusing on poor people to raise your well-being in average so that you score better on the World Happiness Report ranking. Mm-hmm. And so that then gives policymakers a real incentive because they want to look good because they want to become the happiest place on the planet or be in the top 10 to actually focus on the poor people, what they ought to be doing from the very beginning, needless to say. But the measurement is this instrument then to actually help them focus on what really matters. And because well-being is ultimately what matters most to most people, it's great that it now also gets measured at the societal level so policymakers can really use it. And so anyway, long story short, that's what gets me hopeful, the fact that it gets measured properly, because now I know it's going to get done.
Yeah, I love it because you're right. What you're doing is you're part of creating a very generative cycle for well-being to be part of the important conversations that are having about let's create a world that works for everyone. So ultimately that's what you're talking about, but it's creating that engine so that it is part of all of the conversations, policies, it's institutionalized into what we think is important. So
we all feel it's important, but to be able to institutionalize it stems me more hopeful about it actually getting done.
Yeah, me too. Well, I appreciate the work you're doing. I really do. And I'm looking forward to getting to meet you face to face in a few months.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, Renee.